Hello and welcome. My name is Tadej Blažič and I'm a freelance 3D designer from Slovenia. Today we finish our 5-part animation series where we create and animate a simple character from scratch. In this last lesson, we'll create the materials for our character, light our scene and create a background, make any necessary corrections and export our animation. So let's get into it. Now this is what we have so far. In our last lesson, we actually animated a whole character. We animated a whole series of cameras to capture in the best possible way the movement of our character and the beehive. Now it's time to finalize everything. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to create a background. We're going to create the background by first adding a mesh UV sphere. This UV sphere is going to be pretty large, so press S and then scale it up to about 30. So it has to be really big. Let's go into front view and into edit mode by pressing tab. Now we'll choose the vertex select option, press Z to go into a wireframe, and we'll select the whole left side of our sphere without choosing the middle vertices. We'll press X and delete those vertices, so we end up with a half sphere. Now let's rotate that half sphere on the y-axis, let's say to about 60 or 70 degrees. Let's press S to scale and then X twice, so we make our sphere just a bit shallower. Now let's move this sphere to our right by pressing GX and dragging our mouse. And let's increase the size even further, so it looks something like this. Now let's go into our camera view and let's see where our background is not covering our scene. So in this case we have to turn it on the y-axis so it covers a whole portion of the video. Let's scrub through our video to see if everything is covered by the background. Now in this part it might be a bit tricky to see, and one useful trick you can do is select your camera, go into your camera options, and when you're in your camera options choose Pass Part 2 and raise the opacity to 1. This will block everything that's not in your camera view, which is very useful when you need to deduce if your background is covering everything. In this case, it's almost precise. Let's just select our background and switch it on the Z-axis a couple of degrees. In our case, let's turn it about 5 degrees. Check if everything is still functioning in the beginning. Yes. So everything looks good in terms of coverage. Now we have to see how this looks when it's lighted. Press W to shade smooth or search shade smooth with F1 or space. Let's go into our render properties. I will be switching from the Eevee engine to the Cycles engine, and I'll use the GPU compute because thanks to NVIDIA I have two GeForce RTX 2080s that help me render things much faster in Cycles. Let's go into our world properties, and here we will set up our HDRI. You set up your HDRI by going to Color, Environment Texture, and then Open. I have a small selection of various HDRIs that you can get for free on several resources on the web. In our case, I think I'll go with something a bit sharper, which is this one. That's a 2K map. Let's first try and press Shift-Z to see what happens. So right now we have this. Let's check how it looks in our camera view and if we need to make any corrections. Now in this case, the background is slightly darker. If we move forward, we have this sort of lighting. And if we scrub even further, we can see that we have this ugly shadow down here. Now there's several ways of doing this, but before we start moving any of the background, I suggest that we first divide our screen again. And this time we'll not go into the graph editor, but rather in the shader editor. In this shader editor, we'll go under Object on your top selection screen and click on World. And this is going to bring up the world texture. Click on the texture and press Ctrl-T, so it will set up a texture coordinate and a mapping node. And now if we turn the Z around, you can see that we're actually turning the HDRI around. So now we can find the actual sweet spots that we need. I think the most important is how the lighting works in this middle section, that it's basically the longest section. In this case, we want to have sort of a half-half type of lighting, so one side is, let's say, more lighted and the other one is not. So let's scrub the rotation to find an appropriate angle. In our case, I think minus 250 degrees, minus 240 degrees works well. However, you can also choose or change or adapt to the HDRI of your choosing. We still have this shadow issue over here. One quick way of solving that is just press S and then scale it a whole lot more until you see the shadow disappear at the side of the screen. It still keeps the lighting that we have from earlier, and in the beginning it doesn't change anything. We actually have full coverage, and it's not casting a different shadow on our object. There will be a bit of influence on it from the background, but that's completely fine because it's, again, not a real-life situation. When we look at our central part, we can see that we have a couple of shading issues from our beehive, which are very easily solvable by just going into our modifiers tab, and let's just increase the viewport and the render to 4. So we have a very, very clean object. Let's just take care of our collision over here. We're going to go into our object properties, and in the visibility, we'll turn off show in renders. So this means that the object will not be shown in the render. Now we can focus on our beehive. Let's create a beehive material. Go back into your right side of the screen, click on the world and select the object. We will now add a new material. And let's start with a very simple material for our beehive. We won't be complicating very much. Let's just click on the principled BSDF, Control-T, and this is going to, again, insert the texture coordinate, mapping, and image texture. I have to emphasize that you have to turn on the Node Wrangler add-on in your preferences. So you can go to Edit, Preferences, go into Add-ons, and just search for Node Wrangler. Just tick the box and the add-on will be working. You can change the generated to vector, and we can delete the image texture. Instead of the texture, we'll put in a color ramp. So Shift-A, search for color ramp. We will connect the vector to the factorial and the color to the color of the principled BSDF. Let's choose a color. So let's click on the bottom black bar. And let's raise this slightly below the top point. And let's search for a nice yellow, a nice intense darker yellow, something like this. And now we can choose the top, so the white part. Click on it and then scroll to find a nice pleasing yellow, whatever color you like. We won't be complicating too much. In the settings that we have here, we will just use the specular tint and the roughness. So if you drop down the roughness, the object will be very shiny. If you turn up the roughness, the object won't be shiny at all. So we want to find a very specific sweet spot for this style. So we're going to go to 0.4 where we have this nice glossy finish, but we will increase the specular, and the specular is actually the amount of reflection, or rather the wider part of our object. So we can go pretty high to 0.7, and the specular tint means that it's going to mix the specular color with the roughness color. So the specular won't be as aggressive. So we can dial that in very slowly to about 0.6. We can do another small correction here. Shift-A, search for a noise texture, and then Shift-A again and search for a bump node. We'll connect the bump to the normal, and we'll connect the factorial of the noise texture to the height. Connect the generated from your texture coordinate to the vector of the noise texture, and let's increase the scale to something about 30. Now let's increase the detail, so it's going to be very rough, very strong. However, we will just drop the strength so it's barely noticeable. So we have just that bit of texture. Let's see how it looks. Perfect. Looks completely fine. You can play around with the settings as you wish, but for the purposes of this tutorial, I think this is working pretty fine. Let's do the background because it's going to be fairly simple before we move to our hair. Let's create this. Let's rename it to background. And I think we can go with a sort of almost complementing color. Let's go for a nice reddish, yellowish tint. So let's see how that influences our reflections. It's actually adding a nice touch to the whole picture, like so. So we have a very softish type of pink coloring that's also influenced by the HDRI. We can start moving to our B material. Now, before we add the material, let's just click on our bone. Let's go into our object data properties and click in front. So the bone disappears. We don't need to see it anymore. Let's click on our B and let's add a new material. Call it B. There are many hair tutorials and many hair material tutorials on YouTube, especially from Blender Guru, who has a very lovely video on that. But the way I usually do my hair is extremely simple, and I tend to not complicate too much. I just add a hair info node, and then I connect a color ramp again. Now I connect the intercept to the factorial and the color to the color, same as we did before. Now you can see how it's coloring our little bee over here. Now I want to use one of the yellows that we've chosen previously, so I'm going to go to the beehive. I will choose the darker yellow, and I will click on the hex code and just press Ctrl C. So I copy the hex code. Return to my bee, click on the black part, click on the hex, and press Ctrl V to paste the code. So I have the same yellow. Now the whiter part is going to be a slightly lighter yellow, but it's not going to be as yellow as the beehive. So there's a bit of difference there. When you think about bees, when you see bees, you can see that they have sort of a shininess to them, but the roughness coefficient is not going, but the roughness alone is not going to correct that. So we can drop the roughness of our bee material, possibly to 0.2, and then raise the metallic to, let's say, 0.5 or 0.6. We can increase and correct the values later, but what you can see is that our little hairs are getting this metallic shininess to them. We want our bee to have also black stripes. The easiest way to do that is just click on the principled, Shift D to duplicate your node, click on the base color and set it to be completely black. And now we have to mix both of these. So we'll do a Shift A mix shader. Let's just pop it in between the principled and the material output and connect the second node to the bottom socket. Now nothing is happening because we still have to tell the two shaders how to distribute themselves. So we do that in a very simple manner. Just going to select a color ramp. We're going to connect the color to the mix shader, and we'll press on the color ramp and click Ctrl T. So this is again going to set up our texture coordinate and our mapping node. Let's delete the image texture, press Shift A and add a wave texture. Change the generated to vector, and then the vector to the vector of the wave texture, and the color to the color of the ramp. Now we can see how the wave is distributed. This isn't going to work, so we can rotate it on the z-axis by 90 degrees, so the stripes follow the body. We can increase the detail as much as we want, but we should decrease the scale, like so. So we're trying to put in about 3 stripes maybe. The width and the length of the stripes can be controlled by our color ramp. So we're going to click on the linear and choose constant, and now move the white slider so we have nice black lines. We can again decrease or increase the scale as we like and as we wish, but I think like 2 really nice thick lines are more than enough. When we have our material, we just go into our hair settings down here, and we can go into render, material, B. So we make sure that the bee is actually using the same material. The hair, as you can see, is distributing accordingly. Now we will make any necessary corrections a bit later. We can just take care very quickly of our wings. Our wings, let's set the render to 3 and the viewport to 3, so we see that they did not behaving like the beehive earlier. We'll just do the same to both wings, add a new material in our material tab, and name this one wings. For the wings, let's try something a bit different. Let's increase the transmission to 1, so we have almost translucent wings, and we'll decrease the index of refraction to about 1.2 or 1.25, something like this. So it's still a bit hazy, but not too much. We can decrease the roughness to about 0.2, so we can see a bit more through it. And for the color, I think we can go with a nice bluish tint, like that. It's going to really pop in the whole picture. Just shift select the other wing, then holding shift, we can select our first wing again, shift Q, and then copy materials to selected. You again need a add-on for that, which is material utilities that you can find in the preferences and tick it on. Last thing is to take care of the mouth and the eyes. What I do is a very simple material, just drop the base color down to the black one, increase, drop down the roughness to 0.1, the specular to 0.7, and the specular tint to 0.5. That's basically it. Now let's shift select the mouth and the other eye. Again, shift select the first eye, shift Q, copy materials to select it, and we have our bee. Now it's time to check a couple of things. First of all, we have everything baked. Our materials are ready. And now we want to do a test. Every time you do, or rather want to make an animation, do a test render first. I'm going to press F12 and render out one frame just to make sure or see what's happening, and we can decide a bit later. So right away, I can see that the number of the hairs is just too low. And the hairs are also kind of short, so let us correct that very quickly. Let's go back into our view. Let's go back into our hair dynamics. Always return to the first frame and delete the bake. Now we need more hair length, so we're going to go into front view. So we'll increase the length so it touches the collision object. Now the length is not the only problem. We also have to increase the number of hairs, and we can do that by just typing 2000 here. So I'm going to increase them to 2000. And I'm also going to go down and increase the render amount of our children to be, let's say, 90. However, I think that our eyes and mouth will be covered. How can we solve that? Fairly easily. Let's go back into our object constraint properties. And here we can set the distance of the eyes relative to the object. So let's increase the distance to be 0.73. So I'm going to do that same distance for the mouth and the other eye. When we have everything corrected, let's rebake our system and let's see what happens. Let's check our animation. So I'm going to press play. We can see there's a lot of hair. It's not clipping through the object. Everything is working fine. Let's check it in our camera view. Go up, goes towards the camera. Perfect. Now let's see one of these frames. Let's render out one of these frames over here. F12, beautiful. So we have a nice large number of particles and hair. However, we have to just increase the diameter and the root of our hair because it's not covering completely our bee. Let's go to 0.4 in our hair shape, diameter root, and the tip, let's make it 0.2. Let's re-render again. And again, the rendering is extremely fast with the two GeForce cards that I have. It's just a breeze. I can very quickly check everything. So I can see that here we have this nice motion of our hair. It's almost like a furry little bee. So it's exactly what we need. Now you might have noticed something very curious happening. When we move our bee, the texture actually works around the bee, which is definitely not what we want. Basically, we're going to do just a bit of UV unwrapping. Let's go into the inside of our beehive, jump to the first frame so we see our bee in our resting position. We're going to go into edit mode, and now we're going to choose the back of our bee. So Alt-Shift-Select to select the last loop edge. We'll select the front loop edge, like so. And we'll select a middle loop. Press Ctrl E and mark seam. Now press A twice to select the whole thing, U and unwrap. Now we need to change the generated to the vector and drop the rotation to 0. Now it's not necessarily behaving as we want it to. So let's just drag the top of the screen down. And let's choose the UV editor. And if we go into edit mode, we can see all of our fields over here. Now let's select all of these, press Ctrl P, which is going to pack the islands, meaning it's going to try and calculate the optimum sizing for your faces. Let's choose the face selection mode. And let's just move these top faces slightly around so we have a nice empty space. You can move them with G, so you can distribute them accordingly. Try and find the sweet spot. Maybe we can scale them up, also scale them down. So the last part is going to be exclusively just the black part. And the front, we can still make a slight correction. Just move it a bit to the right. Let's check the back. We can still scale it down slightly. Check the front, so everything is working fine. And for our top side of the bee, we can just choose one of these sides and then move them with G so that they join. We don't have to be extra detailed here because the hair will be covering most of it and will compensate for any other losses of detail. When we have this, let's just check that our bee is behaving correctly. Move to the front. You can see everything is moving correctly. The texture is okay. We have that nice little black part and it's flying away. Let's take a look. Let's go to the front so we can see what's happening when the bee reaches the top point. Render out another test frame. Let's see. Yes. So we have a nice little coating. Even if a bit is showing, it's not a huge problem. We can again increase the number of our children. We can maybe go 120 in this case. Let's increase it to 120. Let's re-render again. And let's see how much coverage we get in this case. If you're still not happy, so if you're still not digging the whole look, you can again increase the number of your particles, but you can also delete the bake and maybe add another subdivision point. So it's like render viewport 3. Now we have to return to our first frame and we have to rebake again everything. Let's bake it. Let's choose another one of the frames that should be problematic. Press F12. Let's take a look at how it's going to look. And it's already filled out pretty nicely. You can still increase the number of the children and increase the number of the particles, but if you're happy with it, you can already render it out. So a trick that I want to show you is involving the limits that we were opening in our last session. And this is because we will choose these cameras and we will go into our camera options and check on depth of field. Depth of fields is usually pretty useful when it comes down to creating just that additional spark of interest. So we're going to use the distance. So it's going to focus on our bee when it exits out. So let's choose a nice distance of 15 in our case. So here we can then set the f-stop to be, let's say, 1.0. Go into rendered view so you can see how it looks. Just drop it down to 0.1 and you can see that it really fogs up the picture. So we don't want it that strong, but we can go, let's say, 0.7. Render out one test frame to see how it performs. Looking for a slight mist around our object, we can decrease it even further, let's say 0.4. Let's move to the next camera and we can repeat the same process. So we're going to go depth of field. Let's just go out and see what's happening with the distance. And let's do a f-stop of 1. In these cases, the f-stops will be kind of drastic, but you don't have to worry too much about it. The important thing is that you just add just a slight bit of it. Choose the last camera, depth of field. Let's just check the distance. However, in this case, it's going to be a bit trickier. So we have our bee starting in the low position. So we can set the distance to be there and insert a keyframe. So right click, insert a keyframe, then move a couple of frames to the top. So correct the distance and right click again, insert keyframe. Now you can see that the actual distance is moving with our object. But we don't need it to be that precise, so we want it to lose focus when it's going inside of our bee. So now that we have everything in order, I want to just very quickly make a couple of corrections for the eyes and the mouth. I'll just pick the mouth, go into my object data properties and increase the value of the smile. So it has just a slight little smirk. And for the eyes, we can do one more thing. Blinking. There's a certain philosophy that I use when it comes to blinking, just based on the calculation that I made, that's also based on the duration of a human blink. What I usually do with eyes is very simple. I go into my shape keys with my eye selected, I add a basis, and then I add another key. I go into edit mode and scale the eye to 0.2. Then I exit edit mode, and now I can control the value of my eye. I'm going to repeat the same process on the other eye. When I have both done, I then start to do the blinking. So I'm going to find a part of the video where the blinking is important. So it's going to be here. And I'm going to keyframe the value. I'll right click on the value, insert the keyframe. I'm going to move 3 spaces ahead and I'll increase the value to 1. Insert a keyframe there. I'll move 2 frames ahead, drop the value down to 0.2, insert another keyframe and move 2 frames ahead again, drop the value to 0, insert the keyframe. So this is how it looks like on my timeline. I'm going to repeat the same process on the other eye. I'll just shift select both of the eyes and then in my timeline I'll press Ctrl C and then scrub the timeline again, Ctrl V and just paste the values so they'll blink again. Paste the values again, paste the values again. And my blinking is sorted. Now before we move to final rendering, I'll just rebake the hair particle system. So basically the hair that we've set up for our bee. So to make sure that everything is working as we want it to work. And after baking our hair, we'll also bake our cloth for the actual wings. Otherwise, we won't get any results. Select our wings, go into our physics, find the cache submenu, and we can drop the end to 120, so the baking will be a bit faster. Bake the physics, so that's going to bake the physics for our left wing. Repeat the same process on the other wing, and that's it. We have all of them sorted out and baked. Now it's time for final rendering. Last thing we have to do is render out our project. Now let's go into our render properties and we'll change a couple of things here. I usually do samples from 200 to 250, especially when I have hair. In the advanced, I usually click the random seed or random animated seed. It's useful because it randomizes the noise in the picture, so it's not as jarring in your results. In light paths, I usually leave them at 12. If I have transparency, I set them to 10, transmission to 10, and it's going to be completely fine. Indirect light, I always correct it to 4.5 because it's also one of the factors that influence the noise of your renders. And filter glossy, I set it to 1.5. With the performance, I have auto tile size, which is an add-on, again, that you can set in your edit preferences. And you can search for it. It's auto tile size, which will calculate the optimum size of the tiles for your system if you're rendering with GPU or if you're rendering with CPU. Color management, I always have it on Filmic, and look, I go for a medium high contrast because usually I do lose a bit of contrast when I'm rendering scenes like this. In my output properties, let's just go to render region, which is just going to show me everything in the camera rendered and everything else unrendered. So we can see that everything is working fine. Resolution to 1080 by 1080, which is usually pretty good for Instagram. I leave it at 24 frames per second. To render out, you can just click on your map. In this case, we don't have any alpha channels, so we don't have any transparency of our scene, so we don't need that. We'll just go RGB, color depth of 16, and I'll put the compression to 0. In our view layer properties, I will set up a denoising with the Optics AI Accelerated Denoiser, both color, albedo, and normal. With Optics AI Accelerated, RTX cards have a specific acceleration that actually speeds up and denoises your pictures considerably, and also cutting down render times considerably. If you don't have a RTX card, let's just divide the screen, go into our compositor and set up a denoising in our compositor. So we're just going to use the nodes in the top. We'll drag the render layers a bit to the left, and we're going to Shift A, search for a denoise node. We're going to pop it right between there. And in order to use this guy, we'll have to click on denoising data in our passes, and then connect the noisy image to the image, denoising normal to the normal, and denoising albedo to albedo. And this is basically a different type of denoiser in addition to the optics AI acceleration. Now, the only thing that remains is to render out our animation. So this is it. Basically, we've come to the end of our series. We have learned a lot about hair, about how to design cute and little characters, simple design, simple environment design, simple lighting, simple materials. You don't have to complicate to get really interesting results with Blender. Feel free to experiment with the hair. Thank you so much for watching the whole series. Hopefully you can create some great animations too. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.